Hello and welcome to the Business of Property podcast. I'm Stuart.
And I'm Simon.
And we've been finding, buying and creating income from investment properties for over 20 years. And we talk every week about the reality of running property businesses. And don't forget, very quickly, if you haven't joined the Business of Property email tribe, please do so. Just scroll down to the show notes, click on that button and you can join the list. Very, very simple to do. And today we are very privileged to welcome Mr. Mike Stenhouse to the podcast. Now, I'll just say very quickly, if you haven't heard of Mike, I don't know what you've been listening to, because if you're listening to a podcast, I'm pretty sure you have heard of Mike. But Mike Stenhouse has run the Inside Property Investing podcast for around 10 years now. And it's one of the most popular property podcasts on the podcast platforms. He's also been full-time in property investment since 2013. Mike, that is a very short introduction to your good self. Could you just give our listeners a very quick introduction in your words in terms of bringing us up to date on where you are in your property investing journey?
Sure. I'll try my best. First of all, thank you for having me on the show, guys. Thrilled to be here. Yeah, I have been investing for as long as I can remember. Had a bit of a Sarabini obsession as a child. I've shared the details of that on other podcasts. So normally I expand upon that, but sometimes people interpret it the wrong way. My sort of teenage year obsession with her. So we'll just brush past that swiftly. But yeah, I always had an interest in it. Started investing pretty early on, but a rundown cheap single let when I was 18. And that was kind of my entry point, but then didn't do much for a long time. Went and got a job, did the university thing, and bought my own place, made a bit of money on that, did it on the side alongside corporate life for a little while, realized that I enjoyed my sort of side job more so than the career, and took a leap of faith with a lot of support from my wife. She stayed behind, kept the salary coming in for mortgages and all that fun stuff. And, the rest is history. We built up a portfolio in and around Stockport. I'm obviously not from here originally, but she's not too far away. So we relocated back here. Been here since probably about 2013. I think that's when we started taking it really seriously. And I suppose, the kind of the interesting piece, it was interesting. I still hang on to it because we're not as interesting anymore. We've kind of settled down into normal life, but we sold our house 5 or 6 years ago and went sailing for a little while around the Med for 4 years and tried to keep running the property business at the same time. So that was a fun challenge, a fun period in our lives, and introduced a lot of personal development, shall we say. And now we're back in the UK full time, continuing to invest, continuing to talk about it on the podcast, and just, generally enjoying all the turmoil and all the media headlines that are keeping everyone on their toes just now.
Yes, it's certainly a lot of fun at the moment. And you kind of touched on it there. And thank you for the brief introduction. And we don't want to go too headlong into your sort of your boat journey, because it's I get far too jealous when I think about it. But again, just for the listeners, so something you decided to do was to essentially buy a boat and sail around the world whilst also investing in property. So I think it'd be interesting just to know how you got to that thought before we get into how you actually were able to implement that and make that happen, if that's okay.
Yeah. So from a business point of view, I think we came to the realization, Victoria and I would sit next to each other in our office, in our home in Stockport, most of every day working on the business. And although we were investing in Stockport, I'd go down and do site visits, and, she'd pop to Dunelm or IKEA and buy some stuff. But generally speaking, we were on our laptops and realized, well, hang on, we could kind of do this from anywhere. There are absolutely aspects of investing that are easier if you are on the ground. But, 90% of our time was laptop based rather than like out in the field. So we were young, didn't have any kids, wanted to do something adventure-y, and realized that we could probably we're like, well, if we can do 90% of it from our laptops, we'll figure out the other 10%, which was predominantly like, viewings, physically like seeing the property, viewings, inspections during construction and that sort of stuff. And we didn't have kids, but we had a little dog. So we wanted to go traveling, but certain places are more difficult with dogs than others. We thought, well, if we could take the dog with us, hotels, maybe not. Airbnbs, yeah, it might work, but like flying in between them might be problematic. So let's make our transportation our home. Victoria grew up sailing, and it just kind of came, it was, well, let's go sailing for a little while. Let's go and get our skipper's license. We saw other people doing it. There wasn't a huge amount. I wish there was, that kind of like this well thought out plan. It just sort of happened. And then, as with a lot of things in our life, it was like, oh yeah, here's this cool YouTube video of somebody living on a boat. And then 6 months later, we'd bought one and we were off. So there wasn't much of a plan, but I suppose a gung-ho attitude and thinking, what's the worst that can happen? We'll figure it out, served us pretty well.
It sounds like you follow a very similar approach to me. And I think it's the, building the parachute once you've already jumped out of the plane type approach.
It gives you a certain incentive, doesn't it?
I'm intrigued by the first thing you thought you'd need to sort out. So when you thought about, okay, we're going to be away on the sea, actually quite detached, not as connected, what was the first thing you thought, this is the first thing what's the first domino that you had to knock down within the property business to sort?
So prior to even going, the first one that I wanted to sort out was property management, dealing with people, with maintenance issues, with phone calls about somebody's nicked my food out of the cupboard, like that. I realized pretty quickly it was a big time drain, which was distracting me from higher value tasks in the business. And I realized that after a certain number of deals, I was a letting agent rather than a property investor. So that was the first thing that I wanted to outsource, but we'd made a start towards that before the boat. With the boat, it was more the quality control on our projects. I think making sure that the project management aspect of delivering, whether that was HMO rooms or apartments or whatever, they were actually progressing on time, on budget, but on quality as well. The end product would be something that, wouldn't have a load of defects, or things that we would normally pick up during the build wouldn't be missed.
I think the first thing I'd like to just underscore for those listening, which I heard, which is really good, that you said you needed to focus on the higher value tasks, because it's so easy, isn't it, in property? I mean, I did chuckle because Simon and I were just talking about my 4-hour drive to Dunelm to sort stuff out, and you actually mentioned Dunelm. So that is the glamour of property investing, people.
We all live that life, it's Dunelm, it's IKEA, it's B&Q. Yeah, it's the reality.
Yeah, but I really like that, because in terms of the focusing on the higher value tasks, because too often we get sucked into everything, and as I've heard said, if everything's important, it means nothing's important, and we have to prioritize on that. So okay, so you've thought about the property management, you've thought that is not a high value task. So what were the higher value tasks that you wanted to focus on, and then how did you set about creating the systems and or processes to do those?
So I don't know if I was this enlightened at the time, but the realization I've come to now is where I need to spend time on our business. There's 3 buckets. One of them is finding good deals. One of them is finding enough money to do those deals. And then the other one, as a kind of broad category, is leadership / management. Because a big part of it is, well, if I don't want to do these high value tasks, somebody else does. And that means that we move into a new role of, rather than being the executor, we need to manage the people that are doing the execution. And, people have got personalities and they've got feelings, and, we need to look after them and inspire them and create a nice place for them to work so that they don't leave and work somewhere else, all that sort of stuff. So they're the kind of 3 things that I focus on. Some of that was planned. Some of it took a little bit of learning. But if I know that those 3 aspects are taken care of, we can find deals, we can fund them, and then I can kind of keep the team, and that involves people that we employ and, third parties, whether it's a solicitor or a builder or whatever else. If I can keep them all working towards this shared vision, then, our growth, I think, is pretty much, infinitely scalable.
The first question I've got, so I think we'll probably come back to finding and funding, but when you talk about team, and I know people listening, because this is an age-old equation I think a lot of people think about, is that we hear that to scale and grow, you're going to need a team, whether that's insourced or outsourced. How did you have the cash flow available to basically recruit a team? Or when you talk about team, was that immediately outsourced? Are we talking, initially VAs? So tell us a little bit more about that.
So, I mean, I think, we all probably spend more on our team than we would maybe acknowledge. Solicitors, accountants, there are people that we need to pay for because, not because they do low value tasks, but because they've got a specialist skill set that we can't do. But a lot of us will pay for letting agents. And we got to a stage where probably around about, I can't remember the maths exactly, but we had about, let's say 30 rooms and we were paying, about an average of about £500 per room rental income, 10% management fee, 50 quid a month. So 50 times 30 is £1,500 per month. We kept the management in-house, but we always viewed that management fee as like a salary that we paid ourselves. We looked at that separately. So at that stage, we got to 30 rooms. I was too busy being a letting agent to grow our business any further or at the pace I wanted to. And I thought, well, okay, 1,500 quid, that's almost a full-time employee. I could hire somebody for, $2,000 a month, and managing 30 rooms isn't a full-time job for them if that's all they're focused on. So they'd probably have some capacity to do other bits for us as well. Our first hire was a VA prior to this, but that was more on the podcast side of things. So, I don't really count them. They did a little bit of help on the property stuff, but our first kind of hire into the business was full-time member of staff who was a property manager / like administrative role. And yeah, we put our hand in our pockets for about 500 quid a month, and the rest I saw is funded from the portfolio. So it was, it was an investment, but that £500 freed up so much of my time that, it was a no-brainer, or it certainly is now looking back.
I think that's a really good approach and again, just bringing that out, it's really good that you were managing it, and I think how you've seen that, to take that 10% and say, actually, we'll put that 10% towards someone else to do what I was doing, I think is quite an astute move, actually, to do that. And I'm guessing when you were remote working, so if we just step back to the finding, is that is that you on a laptop on a boat looking at Zoopla and Rightmove?
That was one, yeah. I mean, initially, yeah. And again, a lot of that is desktop based, whether it's researching planning history or, looking at floor plan options. Like, it's still, it can be done remotely. I would occasionally fly home to look at specific projects. I'd try to batch viewings. We came home most winters. Summer in the Med, great. Winter in the Med, it's especially on a boat. Okay, it's warmer than the UK, but in the UK, you've got brick walls and insulation around you. Whereas in the Med, 10 degrees feels a heck of a lot colder when it's just a little bit of fiberglass between you and the ocean. So we'd typically come back to the UK, and I'd have a couple of months over winter. We would usually use that time to find a couple of deals, go back to the boat for 9 months. And, it worked. It wasn't perfect. We kind of sometimes had to force deals that we wouldn't necessarily have done otherwise, and it wasn't perfect, but we made that work. And occasionally, like I say, I'd fly home. I said I'd come home every 6 weeks just to check on things. I probably came home once a summer when somebody really twisted my arm to sign a document or something, and I'd tie that in with a few viewings. But yeah, predominantly we just fit it around the time where we were going to be here anyway.
You just reminded me, I was away in Spain last year, and I was waiting for a document from a bank to get a further borrowing. So, like, probably the most important document. And we were in southern Spain, and I had to drive for about an hour and a half to go to the most random petrol garage in southern Spain where no one spoke English, just to collect something that someone had faxed. So I can totally empathise with, that's a challenge that you may well have faced out on a boat where you weren't even getting petrol garages or faxes.
It's a bizarre, antiquated world, is property. The conveyancing process, the physical signature. I mean, digital signatures are infinitely more secure than me. I'm not saying I've ever done this, but me pretending that I found another British citizen to witness my document. It's bizarre. Like, IP addresses and facial recognition. Why I need to be sat in a solicitor's office in the UK for a bank to be happy that I actually signed the damn thing, I don't know.
It's so true.
We had some some heated arguments there, and ultimately it usually resulted in me losing and then looking for cheap flights. But, again, for 90% of the time to be on a boat, to have to come back here once or twice a year, it was, I think we're very guilty of looking for reasons not to do things. And if that's the word, I can't leave the UK to run my property business because I can't do viewings. Okay, we'll come home and do viewings and then go back to wherever you'd rather be. Like there's always for every excuse you can come up with, I think you can find a good enough solution. And if that sort of alternative reality that you're creating is if you genuinely care about it, then the solutions to those problems, they're worth it.
Definitely. And, without wanting to sound cliched, like a cliched entrepreneurial person, I think sometimes when you put yourself into these situations, you find a solution to the problem. If you just say this is a problem, can't do it, it ends there.
Yeah.
Whereas actually you've actually created a problem by taking yourself out of the country, and then you had to solve that problem if you wanted to continue to build a property business.
I think, a lot of property is problem solving, right? Whether you're here or living overseas or whatever, it's kind of looking at things through a different lens, I think. And that's where the opportunity comes from. So it's a good muscle to build it either way.
Well, our experience is that it's all problems. Okay. There's a few percentage of good stuff like, income and, monthly consistent income when you've built it properly. So we've talked about finding properties, and what we'll do is we'll move on to the funding, because again this is an interesting one, because you've clearly built a business significant enough that it could cope with you taking a boat and going out onto the Med. But when we talk about funding, and we had an interesting question around your podcast as well, how did you set about that? Was your funding from existing relationships, so you didn't have to necessarily work on that or think about that, and how did that work?
So we've been working with private investors since before we went onto the boat. And that was nothing really to do with leaving the UK. It was just a case of, well, the money that we have is not enough to go at the pace that we want to go at. So we can either slow down or, again, we can solve this problem. So finance from other sources kind of came about out of necessity to want to keep growing. And the first kind of, I spoke about this recently, so it's kind of fresh in my mind. The first investor that we worked with, who wasn't either my mom or Victoria's dad, who I think Victoria's dad threw in 10K to her first project, and we were very fortunate that they were in a position to do that, but it wasn't life-changing sums of money, was somebody who was completely unknown to us until we ran a little event in Stockport about buy-to-let investing. They didn't actually show up. They registered for it. They didn't show up, but we had their email address, and then we followed up with them with an offer to, it was kind of, the idea of the event was we talked through hotspots in Stockport and, what good investments were. But we used the leads that we captured from that to say, can you really be bothered doing this yourself? It's hard work, it's slow, blah, blah, blah. We've got a project that's coming up that you can just give us your money and get a good return on, easy peasy. So that was very high level, the kind of premise of some of those early events that we did. He registered for one, didn't show up. He'd just sold a business and was looking to deploy his cash somewhere, and kind of liked what we had done in the past, and was happy to start with us at a fairly low level, and then kind of went from there. And we've just built on that over the years. The podcast helps, but less than you might think, because most of the people who listen to the podcast are like us, like they want to be doing it themselves. So that's not really a big pool of investors for us. But I think having some sort of brand awareness and talking about what you do has definitely led to that ability to raise finance and keep building the portfolio once, our cash ran out a long time ago.
Yeah. Okay. So in that sense, then the podcast is almost just the context or credibility. If people have started looking into you, maybe that you've got that experience and knowledge to deliver on your promise.
If they Google us, it's something everyone should think about, right? If somebody Googles you, which most investors will do, they'll type your name into to Google to see what comes up. And, they'll probably see some companies' house records, which is a good thing if, if you've got an active sort of trading history. They might come across your social media profiles. They might come across your company website, even, likes of this, me being on your podcast. If I didn't have my own, this might pop up and people would be able to listen to some of my stories. So it's all just kind of touch points, helping them get to know, like, and trust me. And I think it's important that we kind of own that footprint that exists of us in the online world, because people will search for us, and we want to know that what shows up is that it's the right messaging.
I think that's a very good reason why I should never seek private investors. I don't want people Googling me.
I need to Google you now, Simon. What's going to come up?
No. Don't do that. I'm curious, when you decided that it would be a good idea to start building a sort of online presence and an audience and things like that, if you weren't doing it to find investors, what was your driving thought behind that?
I didn't have much of a strategy there. Property was, I made a joke at the start about, kind of having that early obsession with property investing. And I did, but more so than that was this desire to be like entrepreneurial, as naff as that sounds. I wanted to work for myself. I got the corporate job because it kept my mom and dad happy, because they wanted to see me, do well at school, and then you can go to university and then you can get the job. So I kind of went through went through the motions there to kind of say to them, right, I've done this, but the back of my head was always, I'm going to work for myself. So I was reading books, but Seth Godin, big marketing guy. I don't know if you've come across him before, but written some good books that I was kind of reading at the time. There was a podcast called Entrepreneurs on Fire, which still goes to this day. John Lee Dumas, the kind of anyway, getting into the weeds here, but he's got a big podcast where he interviews entrepreneurs that I listened to before we moved to Manchester. I was driving from where we lived in Newcastle across to Manchester on a weekly basis. So, I had plenty of time to kill, discovered podcasts that way. There was a few things going on in my head that made me realize that if I wanted to do something on my own, having an audience was, it was probably not going to be a bad thing to do. And I was working on property at the time. So, I started a little blog, and then I thought, actually, no, a podcast can get us out to a bigger audience. And it was, like I say, there was no strategy. I wish I could claim to be smarter than this. It was really just a case of doing it can't be a bad thing. It'll document what we're up to. It kind of sharpens the sword a little bit as well for me having these conversations. I remember some of the earliest guests on the show were people that I had found on Facebook, and I thought, oh, wow, I'd love to be doing what they're doing. How can I have a conversation with them? And the podcast opened those doors. They wouldn't have had that conversation with me, Joe Blogs, calling them up saying, hey, can I take you out for a beer? They might have done, but, a lot of them would have said no. Whereas I've got this podcast, I've got this platform. Do you want to come onto it? It opened doors to a lot of cool people and a lot of interesting conversations that I could learn from. So it was kind of selfish, just thinking, let's run with this. Podcasting seems to be a growing industry or a growing platform. So I tried to make it sound smarter, a smarter decision now than it was at the time. It really was just a case of, I've got some free time. I'm doing I'm a full-time investor now, and I had like one deal on the go. So I was, I had a lot of time to kill, and I thought, well, let's put it to use. And thankfully it paid off.
It's still going strong, and definitely worth a listen to anyone listening here. I recommend you go and check out Mike's podcast. I'm curious, as we sort of move through time, and we've talked a bit about how you had to build your team so you could spend lots of time on your boat. But now you're not spending lots of time on your boat. And actually, a side question, which I won't let you answer straight away, but maybe you can in a moment. Do you still have the boat? But when you're now back in the UK, how have you had to adapt your team? Have you sacked them all and taken over, or what's happened there? So
first, the boat we sold in November last year. So we moved back to the UK. We had daughter who's now 19 months old. So she spent most of her first year on the boat with us, which was exciting and terrifying all at once. we toyed with the idea of continuing boat life. Victoria was more keen than me, my wife, but I definitely saw the business. It was sustainable, it was growing, but it was growing slower than I wanted it to grow. And that passion to be entrepreneurial and to grow a property business hasn't really died in me. So I was aware that being on the boat was hampering that growth to an extent. I was also very aware that our daughter was going to start crawling and then walking and then quite possibly unintentionally swimming, which filled me with dread. So we made the joint decision on the promise that we'll maybe have a boat again at some point in the future. But don't tell Victoria. I don't think that's going to happen. We'll see. We'll see what you'll find out who wins the argument based on whether or not we have a boat again in the future.
I know where my money is.
Well, yeah, I know. But the problem is they're expensive. So we sold that. Actually, thankfully, COVID was a great time to sell boats because everybody wanted to go and escape from land and be nomadic, and so we got more or less what we paid for. Boats are a terrible investment, but we timed it perfectly, purely by luck, and got most of our money back on that. So we sold, moved back to the UK. We didn't sack everyone, although our team has shrunk. We got rid of one person when we got back, and somebody else, Will, who's worked with us for the past 2 or 3 years and was a great asset, very lovely guy. He came to us straight out of university. There was I can't remember, like some COVID scheme to get people into work and to encourage people to hire. I can't remember what it's called. But he kind of came and pitched this to us and said, well, through this grant funding, you'd only have to pay half of my salary and the government will fund 20 hours a month or 20 hours a week or something like that. So we took him on, no background in property, but, this like absolutely the right character. He managed our projects for us for the last couple of years, but as young people want to do, spread their wings, go and experience different things. He's now moved into big sort of corporate world, Manchester city centre, where he gets to wear a suit and tie to the office every day and have lots of people around him. And right thing for him, my idea of a really bad time. So we're now kind of thinking, how do we, what does the future of our team look like now that I'm back here? I'm kind of enjoying being back on with some of the project management stuff, but immediately aware that it's pulling my time away from other parts of the business and family life, which is now obviously ramped up in priority. So the team is transitioning. It's something we're still thinking through. I don't know what the future looks like, but it is definitely more people because I see the benefit of that so much that, I couldn't go back to doing more myself. It just doesn't sit right with me.
Yeah, thanks for that. And remind me not to go and work on one of Simon's teams or to follow I don't know what business books he's been reading, but just get rid of everyone. That's not the modus operandi I've heard many times. But
I wasn't suggesting it was a good idea. I was just curious whether that might have been the course of action.
No, absolutely. The question is logical. It wasn't. I wanted to get back into the business when we came home. I didn't want to get back into the stuff that I was, I'd kind of chosen to get rid of. So yeah, definitely more sort of high level strategic is where I want to be focused.
Yeah, no, that's great. And it sounds like you got your guy from the Kickstarter scheme, and I used that during COVID as well.
That's the one, yep.
Yeah, I got a couple of people from that actually, and it was really good and showed me the level of it. So final thing as we draw sort of into the final throes of this podcast is one thing I'm thinking before we move on to kind of what one of your biggest learning stroke mistakes was in terms of what you've built in terms of the the systems and processes. Have you kept most of that, and do you find that referring to what we talked about before, that you've actually built? Because I tell you what I hate, it's like a lot of the stuff I do, you have to do these, what do they call them, SOP documents, or I forgot what it stands for now, but you basically you write down all of the steps involved of doing a thing, which is like, if you were going to send me to hell on earth, that would be the place to send me, where I just have to sit down and write basically what I call admin.
Yeah.
However, I do understand that is how you set yourself free. So did that happen as a result of what you traveling away? And if it did, is that something that you've retained within the business?
Yes, and yes. I think when it comes to those SOPs, and outsourcing stuff generally. We definitely made a few mistakes. We didn't get it right from the start, and we learned a lot along the way. I think Jess, who came in as our lettings manager into that role, but now very much is kind of more operations director, if you want to call her. It's a very grandiose title for a very small team, but she runs the day to day, not just looking after the property management, but she'll deal with our solicitors and she'll deal with brokers, and like she kind of makes sure that the ship keeps going in the right direction. She came in with a sort of decade track record from property management. So that piece that I really didn't enjoy, I basically, the remit was, you need to come in and professionalize this in our business. We had hired somebody into that role prior to Jess who didn't have experience. And my thinking was, well, we can bring somebody in with, again, I think attitude and character count for a lot, and we will train them up. But without that, it's a very different process to go through training somebody. And if you're quite OCD, as I thought I was, and things want to be done my way, and you like writing these procedures and job manuals and stuff, you can do it. But with Jess, we realized straight away, she came in on day one and kind of saved us like her annual salary just by sorting stuff out for us. So there's definitely times and places to kind of go cheap and cheerful versus pay somebody with that expertise just to come in and get something off your plate. And with Jess, it was absolutely the right decision because she just takes care of it, and I don't need to worry about what she's up to, which is a nice place to be.
Yeah, and that is a great example of why recruitment can be so powerful in a business. And I had an operations manager who's with me and going to start with me full time very soon. And she just does the things that I just have no desire to do. And for anyone that is interested, and I'm sure there's none, SOP is standard operating procedure. And I'm usually good with acronyms, but it demonstrates just how little I like this stuff that I can't even remember that, because I just saying those words makes me shiver. So Mike, you've shared with us a lot about, and it's been really good learnings from what you've done. And I think there's some really useful things in there, hopefully for the listeners. What would you say of the potentially many or several mistakes and learnings that you've had, of all of them at this point in time? What would you say is one of the biggest learnings that you've taken from what you've done in the recent past?
I mean, I think several spring to mind. The one I'm going to share, I'm not even really comfortable talking about it yet, but it's happened. It's past us. We will survive. Talking about our rather gung-ho is maybe the wrong term, but we had a gun to our head with some of our sourcing because we had a strict time schedule. I think the worst decision that I have made so far is to buy a building that we never should have bought, that we have now sold. We got planning permission approved on it. We did a strip out, and then we sold it, and I probably lost 50K on that, just out of pocket, just gone. And that's to me, that's very painful. We will survive, but Victoria's Christmas list might be a little bit shorter this year than I bought that deal in one of our winters when we were back home, because that was just the frame of mind that I was in. Oh, I'm home, I need to buy a deal. It was also about a week before Victoria went into labor. I was in the maternity ward on the phone to our broker. And all of these things should have informed me that I probably should have taken a pause on this deal. But I was bought into growth for the sake of growth. I was bought into, it's good for the brand to be seen to be being active, and all of these things that were external and not the right decision for us as a family, for the business. And we bought this stupid deal that we never should have bought. And there was nothing inherently wrong with the project. It just wasn't the right thing for us at that time. We didn't really have the capacity to give it the attention that it needed. And it just became a noose around our neck. So cutting our losses and losing 50 grand was probably the lesser of two evils. And yeah, it's... I don't know what we can take from that other than, never feel rushed into a decision. If you want to sleep on something, sleep on it. I have certainly changed how I approach things as a result of that. And I'm less concerned about what other people think of me and, oh, what if we don't have a deal on the go at this point in time? Like, only you know what is right for you and your business at that point in time. And, it took me probably trying to showboat a little bit to other people to realize that they're not the ones that are going to be out of pocket 50 grand if it doesn't go to plan.
Yeah, it's very honest, and obviously it sounds like a fresh wound, so we won't put too much salt in
the
there.
The dust has settled a little bit now, so it's the pain is easing. It's a dirty scab now rather than an open wound, I think.
This is going to give you zero comfort whatsoever, but I do think one positive learning is the fact that you are able to accept and acknowledge the sunk cost of the 50K, because I know some people, and I've seen them, particularly with developments that are quite large, where they keep digging that hole, and that hole only goes one way. It just gets bigger, and I've seen a 50K problem become 10 times that because they weren't willing to let go. And as I say, I know it's no comfort to you because that's still a lot of money, but at least I think you had the humility at that stage, maybe not before, but at least at that stage to acknowledge. But the one bit I am interested in, and again, I don't want to go into details, but and I heard the things you said about, going in for the wrong reasons, but was it just that the numbers weren't right for you in that deal to continue? Because you've done the strip out, you've potentially got the team, or maybe not, I don't know. But was it just that you go, actually, this just isn't right in the portfolio from a portfolio perspective?
No, I think that it was probably a series of errors because I felt kind of, well, we need to get this deal over the line. Not just are we going back to the boat, but we've also got this baby coming and that's going to take me out for a couple of months. I either didn't do enough analysis on the deal, or I made it, I persuaded myself that it was rosier than it was or easier than it was. We had other projects on the go that, I often think one deal finished is better than, bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. If we're talking cliches, far better for us just to have cracked on with what we had in the pipeline, finish them and actually get the income from them, than just keep adding more and more to the portfolio without getting anything done. So I spread ourselves a little too thin because I raised the money to do that project, and then immediately I was new dad. And I wasn't thinking about, okay, well, let's push this project forward as quickly as possible. Let's raise the funds that we need to actually do the development on this. So all of a sudden we had, 3 or 4 hungry capital intensive projects and only the funding in place for 2 or 3 of them. And it was just putting pressure on every part of the business. The team were stretched thin, finances were stretched thin, and the deal itself, it was okay, but it wasn't worth losing sleep over. I think as well, there was, a lot of uncertainty. We had this when COVID first came in. Okay, the whole world's going to implode and things are going to change drastically. And then we had the COVID spike. And then more recently, with mortgage interest rates, there's been signs for, 12 months probably now of things starting to slow down again. It was just a big commitment to make without having any real certainty on what the outcome looked like.
No, great. And I think that's, again, itself is a really good learning. It's a cumulative impact of all of the things you had going on, not just one thing, because it's really as simple as that. So we've dunked you into the depressive waters. Let's finish on a higher note and talk about, next for you. So in terms of your property business, assume you've got goals. What are the plans for the IPI portfolio?
So longer term, our overall business vision, if you like, is to create 500 new homes over the course of, I say over the next decade. It might take us 20 years to get there. It's a long-term goal. A decade is a nice round number to put on it. But if we don't get there within 10 years, I don't really mind. It's just a big, scary target to push towards. And, I think that gives us a certain focus, and it brings in interest from people, from partners. it's something that gets me excited. If we can have a very small impact on the housing market and make a profit whilst we're doing it, then that's a great place to be. Shorter term, I suppose it's about continuing to, look at individual deals and get them completed quickly. I think, the market just now is uncertain. So looking at things that, one of my mantras has always been never take on any one deal that could kill you, right? And it was the same with that one that we ended up selling. It was painful, but had that been our first deal, it would have bankrupted us. Thankfully, at the stage we're at now, we were able to survive that. So I think, it's about delivering what we've got in the current pipeline. It's about thinking what our team looks like, because, we've had a bit of change with us moving back to the UK and a couple of our team leaving. There's definitely work to be done on the business and thinking about what the right next step is. Because it's an evolution, and somebody listening to this who hasn't done a single deal might be thinking, oh, well, why do I need an operations manager and a project manager? You probably don't. And equally, somebody who's 10 years ahead of us is, well, we've only got a couple of employees. That's not a business. But it's just kind of thinking, well, what do we need to do now to get us to the next stage? And then when we're there, we can reassess and think what comes after that. So, I kind of, it's the next, I'm thinking, a year out, 2 to 3 years out, what does the business need to get us that next step? And that's probably, a bit of work on the team, continuing to deliver projects so that we can boost that income. And then, once the dust settles on that, and I feel like the team are in a place to go, we'll kind of think, well, do we scale up? Do we do more deals, bigger deals? But yeah, maybe that gives you some ideas to what's keeping me up at night.
Other than a 19-month-old, yes.
Yeah, every night for the last 19 months. Nobody tells you this before you have kids, so they do not sleep. And they can be little monsters. And for some reason, we still love them. They wake up the next day, or we wake up the next day, or, you're all kind of already awake anyway. And this very small, loud package, you're just like, I don't know why, but I adore you with every ounce of my being. And it's a very strange dynamic, but, it's a new challenge, right? So
it is.
Yeah.
And they also give us that fuel to go and do those things. And I think those, big, hairy, audacious goals are, things for me that on their own don't mean a lot. But when we couple into that, I want to do something, I want to build something, both literally and metaphorically, and you've got children as well, I think it makes it even more meaningful for me about creating that impact. So I think that's a great way to end the show. And Mike, it just leaves Simon and myself to thank you for taking the time out to join us today. Very appreciative of your time. And for everyone else, if you've enjoyed this episode, which we hope you have if you've listened up to this point, because that takes dedication. If you have, just scroll down, leave a rating and or review. We'd be very, very grateful. And if you want to comment on anything that we've talked about today, just reach out to us at BIZ of Property on Twitter. That's at Biz of Property on Twitter. And other than that, we'll see you on the next episode.